Thank you for joining us, Dr. Huq. You've just been telling me you're an expert in finance and adaptation. I think my first question is, what do we really mean by adaptation? Because it's a word that's often used, especially at conferences like this, but what do we mean by adaptation and why is it so important?
Well, in the context of climate change, and particularly in the context of the Conference of Parties and the UNFCCC process, it means dealing with the unavoidable and inevitable impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to prevent climate change from occurring. Temperatures over the last century have gone up by about 0.7 degrees, likely to go up by another 0.7 degrees in the next couple of decades. Nothing much we can do about it except cope with it. And in the climate change jargon, we call that adapting or adaptation to climate change.
Sure, and there are many different versions of adaptation. Can you talk us through a few that you've been working on recently?
Well, I do most of my work with some of the most vulnerable and poorest developing countries. There's a group of countries called the least developed countries, who are nearly 50 of the poorest countries in the world, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, one of them being Bangladesh, which is where I'm from originally. And these countries are going to suffer increasing intensities and frequencies of major climatic impacts that they've had in the past. So floods, droughts, hurricanes, and cyclones that used to occur maybe once in 20 years are now going to become much more frequent, possibly once in 2 or 3 years. And they're just going to have to deal with it.
And Bangladesh is a great example, or a poor example, really, of a country that does struggle to deal with these climatic extremes. What is the impact? What impact does climate change have on Bangladesh at the moment?
Well, Bangladesh is one of the countries that is very vulnerable, if not perhaps the most vulnerable country to climate change. It's affected by floods every now and again. It's affected by cyclones that come up through the Bay of Bengal. And there are parts of the country that are also drought-prone during the dry season. So it's a multiplicity of vulnerabilities. In recent years, we've seen the frequency of large floods, for example, what used to be a 1 in 20-year event in the past over the last century has now become more like a 1 in 4 or 5-year event. In the last 20 years, we've had 4 1 in 20-year events. So the frequency of these intense events is going up quite considerably.
And if we're talking about finance, what sort of money are we talking about in terms of weatherproofing, I guess you might call it, Bangladesh's deltas and rivers?
Well, Bangladesh has actually come up with quite a substantial climate change strategy and action plan, which they've costed at the region of $5 billion over the next 10 years or so. And they've actually put in about $300 million of their own money into financing it, and they're requesting the international community to come up with the rest.
And in terms of moving forward, in terms of these negotiations, you were telling me just now that Bangladesh has a very small delegation, which in a sense is a pity because it's a country that really needs to have a big voice at these talks. What work are you doing and your colleagues in perhaps building the capacity of some of these smaller nations?
Well, over the last decade, we've been working very closely with one of the most vulnerable country groupings called the Least Developed Countries Group, of which Bangladesh is one. There are 48 of them. They usually have very small delegations of a few people each, who find it very difficult to follow the negotiations, which often split up into multiple tracks. However, 48 countries is a big group. If they work together as a team, divide tasks amongst themselves, get themselves organized, it's actually quite a big delegation as a group. And what we've been doing is to help them do that. So each year at the COP, we come a few days early, we do a workshop with them so that they can understand what they're going to come up with in terms of the agenda, which can be quite complicated, divide themselves up into teams to follow different tracks of the negotiations, and over time they are getting a lot better.
And you say they're getting a lot better. What has the feedback been to you about the COP17 so far?
The feedback's been both positive and negative. On the positive side, the least developed countries have probably the strongest voice they've ever had here. They've done their homework. They had a good pre-meeting last week. They know what they want out of it. They've been making some very strong statements in the opening plenaries yesterday. On the other hand, they're a bit disappointed with the lack of urgency that they're seeing from the large developed countries primarily, and even some of the large developing countries who are also big emitters now.